Growing up, I was very familiar with names like Star Trek, Star Wars, The Last Starfighter, Aliens, Stargate, Starship Troopers, as well as plenty of other media involving outer space and prominently featuring the word star. It's probably impossible for any one individual to be completely familiar with all the vast colonies of media that explore space travel and the future. Diving into the video game category and ignoring all the franchise names I just mentioned reveals yet another bottomless spawning pool of titles that also include the word star. I'm not going to list all of those here because if I did, this video would be as long as the diameter of the Kaprulu sector with just the Atari 2600 titles alone. It's also not surprising that I ignored or flat out just wasn't exposed to certain video games, no matter their proliferation or popularity. Don't get me wrong, I was playing PC games in 1998, but it was more of a solitary ritual. My schoolyard friends and I didn't really talk about computer games. Like, I never had a buddy tell me, "Oh, you've got to play this," or "I'm gonna bring this CD over after school and install a shareware game for you." So, despite all the avenues and accessibility most people were exploring at the time, I still managed to casually pass by some smash hit star title games altogether. Let's move on to the subject of different video game genres. I was raised on platformers, RPGs, and point-and-clicks. A couple of puzzle-style games here and there like Tetris or similar, but all those years I was never exposed to simulations or strategy games. I think I dismissed them as too complicated or intimidating, and maybe even a little boring. It wasn't until recently that I finally tried something outside of my comfort zone in the micromanagement and simulation hive cluster. That game was SimCity 3000, the delightful third installment in the SimCity series for PC. Like its predecessor, it fits perfectly into the control scheme potential and interface of what's considered a modern PC GUI. You operate with one hand on the mouse for clicking things and the other hand on the keyboard for hotkeys and additional screen navigation. Well, I never played a game like that before SimCity 3000, and let me tell you, it was satisfying to interact with. There was no real barrier for me to learn how to control and manipulate things in that game world because of its intuitive controls that are now ubiquitous on PC, Mac, and Linux. For those unfamiliar, like I was, SimCity is a game that ordains you as a mayor of a city with power overwhelming. Your task is to forge a settlement with relevant infrastructure, economy, and homes alongside services such as medical and security with the hopes that your underlings thrive, prosper, and spread. The game takes place in real time, but gives you control over how fast time passes. As the minutes tick by, problems crop up that you have to deal with. Some are more on the casual side, like citizens demanding commercial zoning or increases to education budgets. Bankruptcy is also a big one. Pretty normal stuff for running a town. However, some dilemmas are more aggressive, like fires, falling space debris, or hostile alien invasions. These require you to, at least in my case, frantically click around trying to execute a solution as your supply depot district's destroyed, the population annihilated, your coffers eradicated, and your reputation as mayor obliterated. But before you know it, you'll be rebuilding over a razed structure's rubble without even bothering to clean it up first. At its core, SimCity teaches you to plan and micromanage a virtual society while letting you go at your own pace. Creativity and goals are mostly dictated by the player, with mild progressive elements to unlock along the way that let you know that you're doing a good job as the Archon of the land. As an introduction to the type of game where you click around with the mouse on a pixelated representation of a map to do fun tasks, this game fills that role. Just keep that manual handy. So, where does someone go from here with this set of restrictions in the nexus of strategy games? Which gateway would I enter next? I'd like to introduce StarCraft, my first ever RTS experience. This game is huge in both its scope and popularity. It's so popular, in fact, that it became an esports extravaganza and practically a way of life for some people. With a fandom that has no doubt created its own dedicated zealots, StarCraft became an all-encompassing phenomenon that I completely missed out on until recently somehow. My journey with it started when I needed an arbiter for choosing the next game to play, and the name StarCraft was shuttled over to me by my husband. I wasn't initially sold on the idea of playing a real-time strategy game, but eventually conceded after some gentle convincing. You see, I've always wanted to take the plunge into strategy and tactical RPGs, but had absolutely no idea how those kinds of games work outside of the RPG bits. There seemed to be an awful lot of micromanagement and menuing involved that looked completely overwhelming to me as someone on the outside looking in. Trying out a strategy game, especially a real-time one without the comforts of pausing to think, seemed like a great entry point into the turn-based strategy RPG realm. But there were also the nagging worries about learning a brand new to me genre in front of a bunch of people on my live streams. There are people who've played this game since they were practically out of the womb, and the idea of walking into it fresh and fancy-free was sure to ruffle someone's feathers along the way. Regardless, I agreed to try out the Terran campaign and assess whether I wanted to continue with the others after that. If I liked it, I could play the Zerg and Protoss runs, but if I didn't, I had an out. We dug out my husband's childhood copy of the game along with the manual and tech tree, but his box was unfortunately lost to time. As a quick aside here, the original StarCraft CD and the Brood War expansion both installed and played perfectly on my Windows 10 PC. Considering how many compatibility issues we normally run into trying to get old games to run on modern hardware, this was pretty impressive. We also installed the official update patch for version 1.16.1, so that's what you'll be seeing in this video. There are a lot of great reasons why StarCraft was a good choice for me as a first-time foray into real-time strategy. One of the most important ones is that it's a couple of steps ahead of some of the pioneers of the genre, like the original Dune or Command & Conquer. While I haven't played those myself, what I've seen of them, for lack of a better word, is a lot more rudimentary. StarCraft has quite a few quality of life enhancements that made some of the more intimidating aspects smoother, which I'll get to later. Another thing that's important to me, but might not be to most people, is the setting and the world building. StarCraft comes complete with some of the most compelling lore I've ever experienced in all my years playing video games, and what I love most about it is that it has absolutely nothing to do with our very own world. There's something off-putting to me about playing a game based on real wars or world events that happened not too far outside of my own lifetime. Playing a role in a science fiction-filled fantasy world instead seemed like a sound alternative. Many facets of some of the factions were familiar, but not too familiar, if you know what I mean. I like a little bit of space between my own humanity and the games I play, and StarCraft did a wonderful job creating that buffer so I could really sink into it. The first mission of the game absolutely nailed it as an introduction to the basics of an RTS. It's referred to as a tutorial and gives you the option to skip it, but I wouldn't recommend that even if you're a seasoned player of the genre. It's carefully crafted to not only show you the ropes of StarCraft systems and how to get going in each mission, but also eases you into your role as magistrate, commanding a small Terran troop. Your immediate job is to usher around some colonists and reassure them they're safe from a newly discovered alien fleet that just came out of warp speed over their solar system. This same alien fleet also just finished autoclaving a planet for yet unknown reasons, and with that threat looming, you're shown all the ins and outs of harvesting minerals and building supply depots, as well as how to assign tasks to various units. Even individual Marines and SCVs get into the on-the-job training. They'll correct your mistakes and encourage you to try doing things differently if you get off track, which I thought was terrific. Just clicking around and lording over my dudes was amusing to me, and I especially liked the SCVs. They're really cute, and they won my heart early on as one of my all-time favorite unit types, but I'll talk more about that later. Not only does this sequence serve as a means to learn about how to play StarCraft, it seamlessly integrates the emerging story at the same time, and managed to do so in a way that kept me rooted in the moment. It's nice that the game holds your hand here, but only as much as necessary. It gives you clear step-by-step instructions to get through the mission, but lets you figure out how to do everything on your own without over-tutorializing the whole thing. I also really appreciated that StarCraft's control scheme didn't expect you to go full PC gamer right off the bat. The interface was really friendly for new players since everything you needed was either up on screen already or only a few clicks away. The visual presentation of the controls made me feel like I was sitting up in a battlecruiser, issuing commands from a bridge computer. This in turn created even more immersion for me as someone with no foreknowledge of this world. Anyway, more seasoned RTS players who wanted to incorporate keyboard shortcuts into their gameplay could, but they were by no means required, and could be ignored completely if desired. StarCraft was kind enough to highlight a letter in virtually every clickable command that could be typed on a keyboard to execute it with the mouse. I did eventually give in to a few of these, like S to start my game from the desktop, or using A for issuing a general attack. It was a huge relief to not need an entire hotkey list just to be able to do the simplest things. My biggest fear was ending up in a situation like I did in Ultima 5 while trying to get on a horse. I had conjured up one from a wishing well, and it took me so long to figure out what to do here. I had my keyboard command list out and read through all of them, trying to use a little logic to hop on my new friend. But eventually, I just started working my way down the alphabet until something worked. Get horse. Nothing to get, how dare you. Hole up inside of a horse, no. Ignite a horse, jimmy a horse, climb a horse, look at a horse, mix a horse. Open a horse, push a horse. Ready a horse, search a horse. This scenario unfolded with absolutely no mounting enemy pressure or even a time limit, and in hindsight, with how intense some things eventually got in StarCraft, there's no way trying to remember keyboard shortcuts would have even been possible for me in full panic mode. For anyone reluctant to try out the genre, I'm happy to report that the controls are easy to pick up, even if they're difficult to master. Circling back to the brilliance of the first few missions for a moment, along with easing anyone new or veteran level into its routines, StarCraft also packs a punch with its story cues. As I was messing around, annoying my SCVs and Marines with grueling demands, a concerning discovery was made. Several of a type of alien called Zerglings were found and killed by troops while they were out patrolling the local area. These monsters just pop up out of the ground and attack. Thankfully, they're pretty weak, and the soldiers turn them into puddles, literally. I got the impression that these particular aliens had been living in this area for a while and weren't the same ones from the recently arrived fleet. These Zerglings seemed more like feral animals versus aliens that could build and pilot spaceships, but I suppose only time would tell. This is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of story time with StarCraft. The manual comes in at just under 100 pages, brimming with everything you need to know about the basics and loads more beyond that. I'm the type of person that usually reads these things from front to back before even starting my playthrough to get prepared, but I approached this one a little differently. I treated the segments for the Terrans, Zerg, and Protoss as history lessons that I only read when I reached their part in the game. This allowed me to remain in the dark about why so many plot points were happening, especially during the Terran campaign. I was asking the same kinds of questions as the characters were, like why the Zerg were there and what their purpose was, or what business those mysterious beings up in orbit had interfering with our affairs down on the planet's surface. I also loved how the backstories for each campaign filled in a lot of blanks that wouldn't have otherwise been addressed sufficiently. You get a lore dump from each mission briefing that supports the immediate task at hand, but in terms of connecting everything in the overarching plot, it can be difficult to follow at times. The thoughtfulness and thoroughness of the writing in the manual not only informed me, but drew me in as well. And not just a little bit either. I got goosebumps reading about how the Terrans ended up in this new galaxy to begin with, or why the Protoss fear the Zerg as much as they do. It gave me understanding of each faction and simultaneously stoked my empathy. Most importantly though, it cemented my integration as a player into the core hall system. I wasn't just some person on the outside going through motions without really understanding the impacts of my actions. It made me feel like I belonged there. The music was also an incredible tool that helped to immerse me even further into this alien world. Each of the 3 groups you play as has their own very distinct tunes that really set the tone well for each leg of the game. The Terran music matched the cool suaveness of the fighters with lots of cool rock and roll vibes. Some music also felt very militaristic with lots of snare drums and horns, but I really appreciated how much the music felt energetic. It had the same kind of eagerness that the jacked up and good to go units portrayed as they were birthed from the barracks. In contrast, the Zerg music feels almost foreboding and chaotic the majority of the time. There's rarely any discernible melody or sense of cohesion in what can largely be considered ambience. It definitely feels the most foreign and unsettling of the 3, and reminded me a lot of something that would mean more to an insect-like race than it ever would to the human ear. The Protoss, on the other hand, had some of the best songs in the game. Much of their music felt almost chorale-like, almost classical in many ways. It had fanciness to it that conveyed a lot of pridefulness and heroicism, with some somberness sprinkled in as well. It was very fitting for our stubborn and pensive alien friends. The main character roster made StarCraft shine even brighter still. You meet new people in each campaign that propel the story forward as you either take control of them directly or fight alongside them. What I especially liked was how well developed many of them are, with my personal favorites coming out of the Terran faction. I like them not only as individuals, but also in their relationships and interactions with others. Hearing Jimmy and Kerrigan's banter or Duke and Arcturus' arguments really hit home what kinds of people they were, and by extension, what they stood for. Having those insights allowed me to form deeper connections to them as people rather than just disposable soldiers of war, as well as understand the motivations around their decisions. The plot's various twists and turns were a lot more resonant because of this too, with tensions running higher because I was actually invested in these characters and cared about what happened to them. Comparatively, I sympathized less with the Protoss and even less so with the Zerg. The Protoss' unwavering, closed-minded approach to their actions and tactics frustrated me. In many ways, they reminded me of the rigidity of the Jedi Council from Knights of the Old Republic. That's a story for another day, of course, but the Zerg were entirely self-serving in their plans, and while I understand the instinctive reasoning behind their actions, I just couldn't get on their side completely. The only reason the Protoss edged out the Zerg in my mind was how haunted some of them were for the moral dilemmas they faced, even if their moral compass was jammed way too far in one direction most of the time. On the other hand, the Zerg were more of a relentless force striving for more and more power no matter what it took. Is he gonna become angry and attack me? I spent a long while trying to decide who the heroes and the enemies of the story were because of all this. There are so many plot developments across the 3 campaigns of the original StarCraft run that I constantly switched sides whenever something new got put on the table as food for thought. This ambiguity and rightness and wrongness was just the ticket to make a new player like me walk the line of that moral gray area between each faction. And because of this, whenever it came time to step into the shoes of the 3 races and play their part, I didn't feel like I was ever contributing to the side of evil per se. The Terrans, Zerg, and Protoss each have their own valid reasons for everything they set out to do, because at the end of the day, each of them were only fighting to secure the survival of their own species. There was rarely a time that I couldn't empathize with each of them and support their plan of attack, even if it was in direct contravention to the cause of their adversary I'd just finished playing as. I actually loved this about StarCraft. Each leg of the game was not only an opportunity to learn a different style of play, but also put more pieces of an extremely complex and interesting story together on the search for some sort of justice or glory. I kept waiting for one group to surpass the others as the true protagonists, but by the end of the game, I was only left with some open-endedness to contemplate before moving on to the expansion. The lack of a true resolution was a little frustrating, but at least I still had more game to enjoy and see if I could ever find an answer to my question about who the good guys really were. Now, in terms of the actual gameplay, I feel like StarCraft could be described as an assembly line that moves faster and faster with more parts to put together properly as time goes on. Like the first mission we discussed earlier, everyone that follows works to demonstrate something new by slowly introducing new mechanics, new buildings or units, and even new enemy fighters. You're expected to take what's shown to you and add it to your toolkit, and at the very least, experiment with some of these new ideas. What's nice is that you don't have to master every unit type if you don't want to after its initial introduction. For example, something like a dropship is necessary in the rare case you can't walk troops up to your enemies because of impassable water or chasms. I used them when I had no other choice, but they were never a part of my regular strategy planning process. There are a handful of units I never used at all that I'll talk about a little bit later, but being able to approach and succeed in each mission in any way you could dream up was pretty amazing. I will say that my strategies probably didn't even come close to other people's that have played this game much longer than I have, but I eventually muddled my way through the entire vanilla experience on my own merits. The experimental aspect of the combat strategy was both a blessing and a curse to me. Never having played anything quite like StarCraft before left me at a major disadvantage while trying to think through its many puzzling scenarios. I cooked up different plans I thought would work based on what I understood about the units I had at my disposal, but would often find myself overrun by 1 or 2 enemy onslaughts. I never had to think about a game's challenges like StarCraft needed me to, if that makes sense. This style of gameplay was very far off from my usual activities, like finding keys to unlock doors, treasure chests for the looting, or looking for enemy tells to find attack openings. Here, it was all about learning how to build up a base and defend it, followed by assembling an assault team that would work on whatever the enemy had that particular round. It took me a lot of failures to figure out the rock, paper, scissors nature of different units, or how to defend my bases at choke points with bunkers, colonies, and proton cannons. I also eventually expanded to accounting for airstrikes that could outrange my units, or clever ways to take advantage of the terrain. Many of these lessons were learned the hard way for me, since I had no idea how many of these missions would unfold or what tricks my enemies had up their sleeves. To put it lightly, getting through much of this game was a trial by fire for me. I would pour all of my resources and efforts into an approach I thought might work, only to learn that it wouldn't be enough to win. In these cases, I would have usually exhausted my resources and not have 2 minerals to rub together to try something new, forcing me to reload. I filled up the save file limit several times to counteract losing too much time trying to backtrack and rebuild. You see why we save first? Consistently needing to jump back to times before I'd truly committed to a failed strategy made my playthrough a lengthy one that probably puzzled and amused the many people who watched for many weeks on my live streams. Despite my initial troubles, I found myself really having fun as early as the 3rd Terran mission called Desperate Alliance. It's a timed one where you have to hold out for 30 minutes until you can be rescued from a base where some Zerg have sprung up nearby. I fumbled around doing my best to build up some defenses and try to fend off the regular trickle of aliens looking to destroy me. Being someone who loves exploring in most games, I actually sent out a little squad of dudes to scope out the surroundings and defeated some little pockets of the enemy I ran into, but I didn't come anywhere close to clearing the whole map. When the timer was starting to get low, I went back to my base because I couldn't shake this lingering feeling about how this mission felt a little too easy compared to the previous one. And sure enough, with 1 minute to spare, that massive Zerg rush hit me like a ton of bricks. As my buildings burned and my dudes exploded en masse, I knew in my heart of hearts that I'd done all that I could in a first attempt to succeed. With only my engineering bay left standing and a single fire bat off screen, it appeared that I'd done just enough to squeak through on my first try. It had nothing to do with smart strategizing or clever tactics, but it was actually a lot of luck that saw me through. And that's when I got hooked. I needed to see the rest of the game after this. While this was a really positive example of beating a tough mission by the skin of my teeth, in hindsight, looking back on the entirety of the game, there are plenty of things that I would do differently if I replayed StarCraft. First off, most of my strife came from simply not building enough units. I either sent out too few or the wrong kind, a problem that persisted all the way to the very end of Brood War. I play all games fairly conservatively when it comes to resources, and I really struggled to convince myself to invest in more fighters in fear of running out of gas or minerals and being forced to start a mission over again. And because I was afraid to really build up a huge fighter pile, I also found it difficult to really push through enemy bases to wipe them out and find more resources. In fact, many missions took me so long to get through that by the time I took over a base, all the minerals and gas were depleted. Because of these factors, I ended up struggling most with getting the upper hand without a lot of trial and error to build up my confidence. A first playthrough with no hints or spoilers obviously makes it impossible to know what's out there. And more often than not, that put me into a precarious position of needing to constantly react rather than defending or attacking well from the metaphorical high ground. On top of being new to the genre, all these elements compounded into quite the frenzied experience. Another facet of StarCraft that was way harder than I expected it to be was the multitasking. In other games, I've never had to split my attention nearly as much as I did here. I usually found myself completely swept up in base building, fortifying, and trying to make new units, and had a really difficult time paying attention to just about anything else going on. Now that we've got the money for it,
we are under attack.
And then we can start making some carriers. Oh my god! Those missions that start you with multiple bases? No chance that any of those other spots were going to survive with any help from me. It got especially bad sometimes when I took my fighting groups out on an assault mission. I always tried my approaches as slowly and sneakily as possible, and usually wouldn't notice when there was a counterattack wrecking my base at the same time. I'm pretty sure I eventually stopped hearing the
"Your forces are under attack,"
because coming back to a devastated base was almost always a surprise to me. I'd like to say I got better at multitasking as the game went on, but even by the end of the Brood War expansion, I was still struggling with keeping track of all the moving parts. Now, I figure it's worth mentioning a few of my favorite things about this entire experience. I've gone back and forth a lot about which faction I liked playing as the best. There are many reasons for this ranking, but when only considering the vanilla game, my order is Terran in last place, Zerg in second, and Protoss at number 1. For a while, I thought that the reason I didn't like the Terrans as much as the other two groups was because I played as them first and was still struggling to learn the game at the same time. While there may be slivers of truth to that, I just found them really squishy and a little too expendable for their cost. The Firebats and Marines only have one health bar that can be completely emptied in 1 or 2 hits, and based on the multitasking problems I mentioned earlier, there were often long pauses between losing all my troops and getting another full force to go back out to try again. I did enjoy the fact that you could move most structures around, and one tip I learned from my husband was to raise them up in the air when they were being attacked by ground troops so that they were out of reach. This definitely saved me a couple of times. I also sailed my buildings to safety and occasionally across the map as a conservation tactic if I'd run out of resources and didn't have enough minerals to build more at a new base I was trying to set up elsewhere. Of all the Terran units, I absolutely adored the SCVs and their cuteness as I mentioned earlier, as well as the ultimate power of the siege tanks. The first time I hit something from further away than it could hit me, it was like I unlocked a secret superpower that I couldn't stop using after that. I'd normally stuff some tanks on top of a ridge and let them crush any unwelcome enemy ground units, or bring a group of 12 around with me alongside support to help whittle down enemy base defense before charging in. My favorite memory with siege tanks was in Terran 10, the Hammer Falls, where I established a small second base on top of a raised area, packed it full of them, and instigated the troops in a huge base right next to me. Every vulture, ghost, marine, and firebat that came marching my way got blown away without me needing to bat an eye. It was wonderful. The Zerg were a little more interesting to play as because they were so vastly different from the Terrans or the Protoss. To be honest, I wasn't sold on them at first because I had a pretty tough time adjusting to the base building flow, specifically around managing resources. Every structure requires a drone to create it, but I didn't mind investing in things like colonies because everything could heal itself. The healing was a huge peace of mind factor for me. Even though units like Zerglings were really delicate and didn't usually survive an attack in large numbers, other units could take quite a few hits and live to tell the tale. When I had enough resources to do so, I tried to make several groups and cycle them to give any hurt units a chance to recover, which helped me feel like I wasn't bleeding away resources like I did with the Marines and Firebats. I also enjoyed the Zerg's diversity and the variety of units that you could command. My favorites eventually became the Hydralisks since they could attack ground and air at the same time. Getting them all upgraded was usually the first thing I spent my minerals on, other than making a spire to get some Mutalisks ready to go. I also really loved the Guardians. Their massive range made them some of my favorites to wander around with. I usually paired them with a Mutalisk pack or Hydralisks to help pick off turrets, spore colonies, and photon cannons when trying to get into enemy territories. They were also useful as backup at the base entrances to help out the colonies too. Despite all the fun that I had with the Zerg, my absolute favorites were the Protoss. There was something really satisfying in playing as them, and I think a big part of why I liked them so much was because of all of the trouble they caused me working up to their campaign. That feeling started brewing in me in Terran 9, New Gettysburg, where I needed to bust up a base in the northern end of the map that was surrounded by photon cannons. I kept trying to bring in my wraiths and other units to sneak up on them, not really understanding what their detectors were at that point. They just kept wrecking everything I threw at them. I dreamed about what it would be like to be on the other side, and when I finally arrived at the third campaign leg, I finally felt powerful for the first time in the entire game. The Protoss units are so strong and robust with their shields on top of a normal health bar, and the amount of damage that some of their units do is unmatched by other factions. The shield recovery also made my investments in units feel more worthwhile versus the wastefulness I've been describing about the Terrans. Without a doubt, my favorite units were the Archons. Making a group of 12 and ravaging everything while listening to their rumbling threats always made me crack a smile. Since they could attack both ground and air units, I rarely had to send a backup along with them, though sometimes I'd bring a carrier fleet for extra overkill. Most of the time, though, I parked my carriers at my base and left them to fight off invaders. I also leaned heavily on photon cannons. They were usually my first investment in building my base other than dragoons and zealots. The fact that the cannons served as air and ground offense and detectors brought me indescribable joy because that was one less thing that I needed to think about. When I finally got my hands on arbiters, one of my favorite things to do was park a bunch of cloaked units in front of my photon cannons with a carrier to blow away anything that got close to my base entrance. It worked like a charm every time. Alongside all these standouts, there was a subset of units that I only tried out once or twice and then never again unless a mission required it. I'm a creature of habit, so once I found something I had success with and understood well, I wasn't likely to switch up to new tactics without some kind of compelling reason to do so. And if you've been listening closely throughout this video, you might have already realized that anything involving a high degree of micromanagement was simply out of the question for my playstyle and skill level. Options like Zerg Defilers and Queens or even Protoss Reavers, while amazing in what they had to offer, required a bit too much of my attention when the going got tough. In the heat of the moment, I just wasn't fast enough to launch Queen Broodling attacks or remember to reload my Reaver Scarabs, all the while having my other units doing the things I wanted and needed them to. I enjoyed commanding larger groups with simpler combat options instead. This was just a personal preference, of course, and I can imagine that these more specialized fighters would create a bigger advantage in multiplayer combat for those able to wield them well. For someone like me meandering through the single-player experience, I was fine to leave them out. A few times throughout the video so far, I've mentioned that I also played the Brood War expansion after completing the base StarCraft experience, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that here. First and foremost, I loved that there was somewhere to go after the vanilla game ended. I'm obviously having this first-time StarCraft experience now rather than in the 90s, and StarCraft 2 has been out for many years by this point. But it's nice that there was just some more of the original game to enjoy without any major changes to the interface or appearance. I also really liked that the first level of the expansion felt like level 31 instead of reverting the difficulty back to basics again. While this made the transition to the new content feel very natural, it also meant that towards the end of the expansion, the missions were incredibly tough for me to manage. Difficulty isn't inherently a negative to me, but eventually I had to turn the game speed down to a crawl just to be able to think straight. There's no shame in lowering the game speed, of course, but for some context, I didn't need to do that for the first time until pretty deep into Brood War. I think that's a testament to just how nasty things can get. I should also mention that there was one entire mission that I couldn't actually beat on my own. It was the third to last one called To Slay the Beast, where you're up against 4 different enemy groups that are not only throwing everything that they have at you individually, but also coordinate their attacks. Because my husband's the reason I ended up having this whole game experience in the first place, I tapped him in to play it through for me after my attempts failed several times. So technically, I didn't beat Brood War all on my own. I did complete 26 out of the 27 missions by myself though. An aspect of the expansion that I really enjoyed was the incorporation of new units. All these additions really leveled out a lot of the easy mode aspects of the original game's unit repertoire, for better or worse. No longer could I just charge into every mission with a pack of Zerg flyers or an Archon pile as I'd gotten used to doing. Coming back around to the difficulty for a moment, the computer really kicked up its offense and defense strategies here, and a lot of that was heavily reliant on some of these new units that could be used to their fullest potential against me. Seeing a fleet of Devourers approaching my helpless Guardians or seeing a bunch of Lurkers picking off my ground troops was as infuriating to me as it was fascinating. I took in a lot of great tips and tricks from the AI, but as I mentioned earlier, I was not nearly fast enough to be able to integrate most of that information well enough into my own strategies to give myself any kind of edge. Some of my favorite new units were the Medics and the Lurkers. The Medics more or less turned my opinion of the Terrans around in the expansion, since my biggest beef with them was how expendable they were in the vanilla game. Sending a medic along to heal my units and preserve them a little longer made a huge difference in my ability to manage resources or trust groups of troops to go out on their own without me hovering over them constantly. The Lurkers were also a fantastic addition to give some good range over and above what my colonies could do. I especially liked sticking them up on a ridge to poke at enemy buildings and structures down below. It usually took a while for my adversaries to catch on, and I was successful with the strategy more often than not. For this next part, I want to talk a little bit about Brood War's story, and while I normally wouldn't mention spoilers in a review like this, there are a few things I feel are worth mentioning. If you don't want to hear about anything that happens plot-wise in the expansion, feel free to skip ahead to the next section. Alright, here we go. I mentioned earlier that the conclusion to StarCraft was pretty open-ended, and that I was really curious to see where those characters I'd grown so fond of ended up. And honestly, I felt like Brood War's weakest point was its story. The original game had such great flow and cohesion in its narrative, with likable characters and some truly unexpected turns. Many of the new people in Brood War, like Rashagal, Duran, and Artanis, dominated the main stage, and they just weren't the people I was interested in hearing about. I wanted to know what happened to Jimmy and Kerrigan, Blob 1 and Blob 2, or some of the more prominent Protoss like Phoenix. While these people definitely stepped into and out of the spotlight throughout Brood War, there wasn't enough focus on any of them for my liking after building them up so much pre-expansion. There were two major parts of the plot that really didn't sit well with me, and the first was around the matriarch. There was no mention of her whatsoever in all of the lore that I read about the Protoss in the StarCraft manual. So the fact that she was just suddenly there as part of the Dark Templar movement and served as an enormous plot device felt contrived to me. I feel like they just shoehorned her in there for the sake of it, and it would have been a lot nicer if there'd been some connection to the backstory in the original game rather than just amending it after the fact. I also really didn't like what they did to Kerrigan's character. For the majority of the vanilla game and even into Brood War, I was completely on her side. I understood her actions considering all the horrible stuff that happened to her, like being left to die by Arcturus and being captured and assimilated by the Zerg. In the beginning of the expansion, I feel like she was right in wanting to regain her autonomy by finding a way to kill the Overmind, even if it meant manipulating a few people to get the job done. Towards the end of the expansion, though, she lost that spark of goodness that made me empathize with her and just became, well, supremely evil. And just evil for the sake of it, truly becoming corrupt through and through. I'm the type of person that feels bad when I have to do bad things in games. To say that the last half of the Zerg campaign of Brood War was excruciating to get through from a moral standpoint is an understatement. I was forced to do many terrible things I didn't want to, with the worst one being killing Phoenix, and I guess Duke too, as much as I didn't like him. Was it shocking? Absolutely. Intense? Sure. But to take someone that I really sympathized with and see her get all twisted up into something so ugly made her victory at the end feel empty. I didn't want to root for her anymore, yet it was by my hand that she was able to conquer everyone and everything in her wake. Yay. Even more disappointing to me was how open-ended they left the final scene of the expansion. Kerrigan's whole soliloquy with the "I'll test their strength out later" sentiment felt so lazy to me from a writing standpoint. Where was Jimmy with his threat to kill her when she least expected it? I wanted to hear him grinding his metaphorical axe to get revenge for all the people he lost, or even see what happened to Duran or Zeratul. There were so many loose ends that were not even remotely tied up, making the ending feel more like sequel staging rather than actually providing satisfaction for a job well done. When the writing takes a backseat to coercing people into buying the next game experience, it really cheapens its impact. As if Blizzard would have had any problem getting people to buy the next game in the series, but I digress. I think they could have concluded the story a bit more creatively and still paved the way for a follow-up at the same time, but it seems like they chose the easy way out instead. With how bummed out I was about Brood War's story as a whole, I really did like one new aspect, the introduction of choice. There were a few missions where I got to choose to pursue one or two outcomes and see those effects play out in the missions that followed. I thought this was pretty neat, even if the consequences were pretty minimal. I liked that this provided a fresh take on how the game flowed in a couple of places, and gave me a reason to replay some parts again in the future. A little replay value goes a long way in my books, though obviously there's tons to experience differently with the base game and the expansion just by changing up what kinds of units you primarily use. It's definitely a game with seemingly limitless diversity in playstyle for those looking to mix it up. Reflecting back on StarCraft is pretty surreal. It was only a few months ago that this game felt completely insurmountable to me, but standing on the other side of the credits, I feel like it's provided me with some really important insights. I don't think that saying StarCraft is a good game is enough. It's so much more than good. It was such an important part of so many people's gaming histories and created an entire phenomenon that has continued to burn brightly since the 90s. The few months I spent streaming the base game and the expansion permitted me a small glimpse into a fan base that is passionate about anything and everything StarCraft. So many people shared memories of playing this at a LAN party or with friends in university or college. They talked about hearing the dreaded nuclear launch detected and then hearing their roommates laugh maniacally from the next room, or the thrill of mounting a risky but successful probe rush against a pal right out of the gate. And I can't forget all the fun stories about the map editor. Some people lamented being asked by a friend to play their cool new custom map, only to learn too late that it was completely built in their friend's favor. The fact that something like a map builder was included on the disc day one of release is something that modern gamers can only dream of in a world of paid downloadable content. If I liked something like SimCity 3000 as much as I did recently, I can only imagine how much fun I would have had with StarCraft's map builder if I'd owned the game back in the day. As someone who really didn't even know how to group or move units around when I started this whole endeavor, I'm pretty proud of myself for getting through to the end. I can't really describe my personal rank as anything higher than an amateur, but I've really enjoyed the journey. It goes beyond everything StarCraft provided me in its challenging gameplay and story. A big part of it is also the undeniable sense of connectedness to other people that have had this experience too. I'm extremely grateful to have encountered StarCraft and finally understand what it means to so many people. Because I never got a chance to enjoy multiplayer back in the day when it was new and could never survive for more than 5 seconds against anything but AFK players these days, I'd love to live vicariously through some of you. I invite you to share your favorite memories from online play or even relive some of your single player experiences with me in the comments. And as always, thanks so much for watching.